Didn't have birth certificates in those days, so nobody's very sure, but about 480 years after Christ. As a young man, he was sent to study in Rome, but he was soon appalled by the corruption that he found in society, and he withdrew to live as a hermit at a place called Subiaco. He quickly attracted disciples, and he began to establish small monasteries in the neighborhood, small collections of Christian brothers who lived together in poverty, sharing goods in common, praying for the world. But around the year 525, a disaffected faction tried to poison him, poor fellow. So Benedict moved then to Monte Cassino with a band of loyal monks. Later in life, he wrote what has become absolutely central to particularly Benedictine monasteries. He wrote his Rule for Monks, or sometimes known as Benedict's Rule. It was based on his own experience of fallible people trying to live out the gospel. He recognized that we're all human, we're all fallible, and we need some guidance about how we should live together. He never particularly intended to found an order of monks, but his rule was so good that it was disseminated and widely followed, and it became a model for Western monasticism. Benedict died at Monte Cassino in about the year 550. But the Rule of St. Benedict is still, 1,500 years later, a highly respected manual for the governing of monasteries and other church communities. It has a wealth of good advice for anyone who is involved in any kind of Christian community, from the leader down to the lowliest and newest member. For example, Benedict offers this advice to an abbot, which in my case might mean the rector, or in the bishop's case, the bishop. So this is what Benedict says. Let him, that is the leader, the abbot, recognize that his goal must be for the profit of the monks, not preeminence for himself. He ought, therefore, to be learned in divine law so that he has a treasury of knowledge from which he can bring out what is new and what is old, referring to Matthew chapter 13. He must be chaste, temperate, and merciful. He should always let mercy triumph over judgment, referencing James chapter 2, so that he too may find mercy. Later, Benedict goes on, let him, that is the abbot, strive to be loved rather than feared. Excitable, anxious, extreme, obstinate, jealous, or over-suspicious, he must not be. Such a man is never at rest. Instead, he must show forethought and consideration in his subjects. And whether the task he assigns concerns God or the world, he should be discerning and moderate, bearing in mind the discretion of holy Jacob in Genesis chapter 33, who said, "If I drive my flocks too hard, they will all die in a single day." So that's me told then, isn't it? I've got to guard against being excitable and anxious and obstinate, and I am not to drive my flock too hard. So Sandra, you can relax. I'm not going to be driving you too hard in your new role, I promise. The rule of Benedict was so important that every day of the year, the brothers in a monastery would gather to listen to one chapter of that rule being read. This gathering simply became known as the chapter, and the meeting hall in which they gathered was called the chapter house. So if you visit any great church today and you find a chapter house, you can be sure that that church was once a monastery. Monasteries were foundational institutions throughout Europe and certainly in the UK. Both Benedictine and Franciscan abbeys were responsible for massive amounts of land, providing work for thousands in agriculture, They provided hospitals, healing for the sick, and for the spread of knowledge through their gift of copying manuscripts and sending them all over the world. Entire communities would grow up around these abbeys. If you've ever been to Glastonbury or maybe to Battle near Hastings, or indeed to Walsingham, beloved by many here, then you can plainly see how an entire local economy both supported and was supported by these abbeys in the centre of their communities. Around 1,000 years after Benedict, in around 1500, they were a significant force for good in our nation. And they were, by then, very wealthy institutions. Sometimes, doubtless, they were too wealthy. Sometimes they had corrupt leaders who would line their own pockets from that wealth. Some monasteries were famed for the laziness of their monks, which should not be a surprise, given that all institutions run by humans will always have a few bad apples. That's why Benedict wrote his rule in the first place. The great sadness is, of course, at least to me, that Henry VIII eyed the wealth of those monasteries and abbeys with avarice. He and his lieutenants worked out that they could simply take control of these abbeys with the military might available to them from the state. They could plunder all the precious jewels and metals. They could sell off the stone and the timber and the roof tiles as building materials. And then finally, they could sell the land to their wealthy mates, which is how we end up with abbeys that were then turned into mansions for the wealthy, like Titchfield near us and Netley down in Southampton. There's even a rumour that I have been unable to verify, I want to make this very clear, but it's an interesting rumour, that there was once a small monastery here in Havant, just where the Pallant Centre is today. Now that does seem possible and even likely, because Havant was on what we now call the Old Way, which was a pilgrimage route from Southampton to Canterbury. A little known function of monasteries was to provide safe harbours for weary pilgrims and travellers. So it wouldn't be at all unusual for there to be a monastery at this point on the road, just on the crossroads of east and west that had been left by the Romans. As I say, I haven't found any proof of this rumour, but it's nice to think that our community centre, our Pallant Centre, still serves the local population in much the same way that that monastery might have done. The word Pallant, by the way, means palace. And it's possible that the Pallant Centre itself was the site of an abbot's palace. But anyway, enough speculation. The effect of the loss of the monasteries in England should not be underestimated. No doubt, as I've already said, they were too rich. No doubt some of them were corrupt. No doubt some of them put heavy burdens on their serfs. No doubt many failed to live up to the high ideals of the rule of St. Benedict. But, with all that said, they also provided hospitality to travellers. They provided food to the poor of their community. They provided health care for the sick. They provided a meaningful life for many poor sons and daughters who became monks and nuns. And they provided literacy for all. With their dissolution, the ruling class of our country around the king took control of all the land that had been previously owned by the monasteries. Too often that ruling class felt little sympathy for the poor, who then frequently starved. Hospitals were closed without monks and nuns to run them. Healthcare became effectively privatized until the arrival of the National Health Service in 1947. Literacy became the preserve of universities and scholars, not of the common people anymore, until the church became strong enough once more to provide the first English schools, one of which was set up across the road from here in what was and what is now our charity shop. That building was originally built to be a Sunday school, a school not just to learn about the Bible, but also to learn reading and writing. Local poor children who couldn't afford to go to grammar schools would be educated by the church there. The land on which the poor had grazed their animals, because it was abbey land and therefore it was their land, became enclosed and sealed off for the exclusive use of the lords of these new abbey manors, so they could go hunting and shooting. Under Henry VIII, Benedict's vision of a group of Christians living prayerfully together, loving God and serving their neighbour, crumbled into the ruins that we now visit on sunny days. The wealthy elite plundered the wealth, and many of those with inherited wealth today still live off the proceeds of what their ancestors essentially plundered from the church. Today's monasteries, at least here in England, are a pale shadow of their great Benedictine forebears. Most of them have practically no land, and they make their living through charitable gifts from people who visit them and through tourism and gift shops. Perhaps you visited Buckfast Abbey in Devon, which was a famous and favourite place of mine when I was young. Perhaps you, like me, have bought some Buckfast Abbey wine and enjoyed. That's the way that they make their living these days. But the flame of Saint Benedict still flickers. From time to time, it still calls young men and young women to take up the challenge of living prayerfully in community, in poverty, loving God and serving their neighbour. Such abbeys, few as they are, still shine a light into our consciousness. They remind us of the fundamental duty of all Christians to live together in love and to care for all those we encounter. Amen.